March 14, 1972. Lowe's State Theatre, Broadway. The lights dimmed. Marlon Brando appeared on screen as Don Vito Corleone, and standing next to him, fumbling his lines, sweating bullets in that iconic wedding scene, was a man who didn't have to act. Because Lenny Montana wasn't just playing a mob enforcer, he was one. This wasn't method acting, this was the real thing. A professional wrestler turned arsonist for hire, a bodyguard for the Colombo crime family who somehow ended up in the most celebrated Mafia film ever made. And that nervous energy you see on screen? That wasn't Luca Brasi being intimidated by the Godfather. That was Lenny Montana. Genuine tough guy, absolutely terrified of Marlon Brando. This is the story of how organized crime infiltrated Hollywood's biggest production, how a man who made people disappear for a living became an accidental movie star, and how the line between fiction and reality blurred so completely that nobody could tell where the performance ended and the real mobster began. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Montana wasn't just muscle, he was a specialist, and his presence on that set wasn't random, it was strategic. Because when the Mafia shows up to your movie about the Mafia, you better believe they're sending a message. Leonardo Passafaro was born March 13, 1926 in Brooklyn, New York. Italian immigrant parents, poverty everywhere. Streets controlled by neighborhood gangs who answered to men in expensive suits. By the time Lenny was 16, he stood 6'6" and weighed 220 pounds. That kind of size opens doors. Specifically, doors to wrestling rings and social clubs where men conducted business that never appeared in ledgers. The 1940s in Brooklyn meant one thing. If you were big, Italian, and hungry, you had options. You could break your back in the shipyards for nothing. Or you could break other things for people who paid better. Lenny chose the latter. But first, he needed a cover. Something legitimate on paper. Something that explained the cash and the bruises. Professional wrestling in 1953 wasn't what it is today. No pyrotechnics, no scripted storylines broadcast to millions. This was territory wrestling, small venues, real blood. Crowds that smelled like cigarettes and spilled beer. Montana took the ring name Zebra Kid, black and white striped tights, a gimmick that played on racial tensions of the era. He worked the circuit hard. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, small-time promotions that paid $50 a night when you won, $25 when you lost. Wrestling gave him visibility. It gave him a reputation for taking punishment and dishing it out harder. But more importantly, it gave him access. Because the men who owned wrestling territories in the 1950s had connections, deep connections, to the families that ran New York. By 1956, Montana had made his real choice. He started working for the Colombo crime family, not as a made man, he was never inducted, but as an associate, a freelancer. The kind of guy you called when you needed a problem solved quietly. And Montana had a specialty that made him valuable: arson. You have to understand how arson worked in organized crime during this period. It wasn't just about destruction. It was about sending messages, about insurance fraud, about clearing properties for development, about making witnesses reconsider their testimony. Montana became an artist at it. His signature method? Kerosene-soaked mice. He'd tie rags soaked in accelerant to the rodents, light them, and release them into buildings. The mice would scatter, panicked, spreading fire to multiple points simultaneously. Investigators couldn't trace a single ignition source. Beautiful chaos. He didn't do this for ideology. He did it for money. $2,000 to $5,000 per job, depending on the target. That's $15,000 to $38,000 in today's money. Tax-free, cash in hand. And Montana was good enough that he stayed off law enforcement radar for years. But here's the thing about being a mob associate. You're never just one thing. Montana was muscle when needed, bodyguard duty, collections, the occasional beating that needed to look accidental. He had a reputation in Brooklyn as someone you absolutely did not cross. Not because he was the smartest guy in the room, but because he was the guy who'd follow through when everyone else hesitated. His wrestling career continued through the 50s and into the early 60s. Regional success, nothing national. In 1961, he had another run as Zebra Kid, but by then, everyone who mattered knew what Lenny Montana really was, and that made him more valuable. Because a famous wrestler who also worked for the mob was worth more than either thing alone. By 1971, Montana was 45 years old. Still massive, still intimidating, still doing enforcement work for the Colombo family, and that's when everything changed. Because Hollywood decided to make a movie about the Mafia, and the Mafia decided to make sure Hollywood got it right. You need to know about Joe Colombo to understand what happened next. Joseph Colombo Sr., born 1923. By 1970, he ran the Profaci crime family, renamed the Colombo family in his honor. 5 feet 7 inches tall, silver hair, expensive suits, and a brilliant, delusional idea. He was going to legitimize the Mafia by denying it existed. In April 1970, Colombo founded the Italian-American Civil Rights League. The premise was simple. Italian Americans were being discriminated against through stereotyping. Every time FBI agents investigated Italian businessmen, it was ethnic profiling. Every time prosecutors targeted organized crime figures, it was bigotry. The Mafia wasn't real. It was a racist myth invented to oppress hard-working immigrants. It was absurd. It was brilliant. And somehow, it worked. Colombo got 40,000 members to sign up. He organized rallies, got celebrities involved. Frank Sinatra performed at fundraisers. The League raised over $500,000, and Colombo convinced himself he was a civil rights leader, not a crime boss currently under federal investigation. Then Paramount Pictures announced they were adapting Mario Puzo's novel The Godfather, and Joe Colombo lost his mind. The book had been a massive bestseller since 1969. Puzo's fictional Corleone family was transparently based on real mafia families. Every reader knew it. And now Hollywood was going to put it on screen with Marlon Brando. Show America exactly how organized crime operated. Display the violence, the corruption, the structure. Everything Omerta demanded remain hidden. Colombo's League immediately threatened to shut down production. They claimed the film would defame all Italian Americans. They organized protests, got politicians involved, put pressure on Paramount's parent company, Gulf plus Western. CEO Charles Blue Dawn started getting nervous. This movie was a $50 million investment. If the mob shut it down, the losses would be catastrophic. Producer Al Ruddy needed to negotiate fast. In early 1971, he met with Colombo and League representatives at La Scala restaurant on East 54th Street in Manhattan. The room was full of made men pretending to be civil rights activists. Everyone knew the game being played. Ruddy needed their permission to film in New York. They needed concessions. The deal they struck was fascinating. The League agreed to let production proceed. In exchange, Paramount removed every instance of the words Mafia and Cosa Nostra from the script. The film would show organized crime but never name it explicitly. Additionally, the League would consult on the production, and by consult, everyone understood what that meant. The mob would have observers on set, people watching, making sure nothing happened that disrespected them or their operations. That's where Lenny Montana came in. Francis Ford Coppola started filming The Godfather on March 29, 1971, principal photography in New York. And from day one, there were men in expensive suits watching from the sidelines. Not actors, not crew, mob representatives making sure the deal got honored. Montana was assigned as a bodyguard for one of the senior Colombo family members overseeing production. His job was simple. Stand there, look intimidating, make sure nobody got brave ideas. He'd been doing this work for 20 years, just another assignment. Except this time, Francis Ford Coppola noticed him. Coppola was 31 years old, brilliant but inexperienced with this scale of production. The studio didn't trust him. Brando was considered box office poison. Al Pacino was unknown. Everything about this production was a risk. But Coppola had vision, and when he saw Lenny Montana standing there, 6'6", 230 pounds, with that face that had seen things, Coppola saw Luca Brasi. In Mario Puzo's novel, Luca Brasi is Vito Corleone's personal enforcer. Not the smartest soldier, not the most strategic, but the most feared. Brasi's backstory in the book is genuinely horrific. He murdered his pregnant girlfriend by throwing her into a furnace alive. He killed for pleasure as much as business. The novel describes him as someone even other mobsters feared, a psychopath kept on a leash by Don Vito. Coppola needed someone who could convey that menace without words, someone whose presence alone communicated violence. Professional actors could fake it, but Montana was it. And there was something perfect about casting an actual mob enforcer to play a fictional mob enforcer in a movie the real mob was supervising. Here's what makes this decision insane. Montana had zero acting experience. He'd never been on a film set before except as security. Couldn't remember lines. Didn't understand camera angles or hitting marks. By every professional measure, he was the worst possible choice. But Coppola understood something the studio didn't. Authenticity matters more than technique, especially in a film about authenticity. Montana was hired in April 1971, paid scale, probably around $500 for his few days of work, which was less than he made per arson job, but this was legitimate income. On paper. And there was something appealing about that. Being in a movie, people would see his face, know his name. It was a kind of immortality crime never offered. His biggest scene was the wedding sequence. The Corleone family celebrates Connie's marriage to Carlo Rizzi. In the book and film, Luca Brasi arrives to pay respects to Don Vito. There's a moment where Brasi rehearses what he'll say. He's terrified of the Godfather despite being a killer himself. Then he enters the office, stumbles through his greeting, and the Don warmly dismisses him. This scene is 45 seconds long. It required Montana to remember maybe 30 words of dialogue, and he absolutely could not do it. Take after take, Montana fumbled lines, forgot cues, stood in the wrong spots. The crew was getting frustrated. They had 200 people working that day. Every minute cost money. And this non-actor was blowing simple dialogue. But here's what made Montana freeze. It wasn't the cameras, it wasn't the pressure, it was Marlon Brando. By 1971, Brando was arguably the greatest film actor alive. 2 Oscars, A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront. Last Tango in Paris was filming concurrently. This was a legend. And Lenny Montana, who'd set buildings on fire for money, who'd beaten men half to death for late payments, was absolutely starstruck. Crew members later reported that Montana's hands were shaking. He was sweating through his suit. Between takes, he kept apologizing, said he was nervous. Brando, to his credit, was patient, tried to relax Montana, told him jokes, but it didn't help, because Montana wasn't acting nervous. He was genuinely terrified, and Francis Ford Coppola realized something brilliant. This was perfect. Coppola made a creative decision that defines his genius. Instead of trying to make Montana comfortable, he used the fear. He told Montana to rehearse his lines before entering the office. Filmed that rehearsal as part of the scene, then filmed Montana's actual stumbling, nervous delivery with Brando, and he kept it. All of it. The stammering, the fumbling, the genuine anxiety. Watch that scene today. That's not acting. That's a real person, scared out of his mind, trying desperately not to embarrass himself in front of Marlon Brando. And it works perfectly. Because Luca Brasi is supposed to be intimidated by Don Vito, the most feared enforcer in New York, reduced to a stumbling mess in front of his boss. Montana's inability to act became the most authentic performance in the film. The wedding scene was shot in March and April 1971 at a private home at 110 Longfellow Avenue in Tot Hill, Staten Island. 2 days of filming, hundreds of extras. Montana spent most of it standing around, being imposing, which he was excellent at. His other scenes were minimal, being strangled to death by Sollozzo's men. That required him to make choking sounds and go limp. He managed it. Production wrapped in August 1971. Montana went back to his life. Bodyguard work. Whatever else the Columbos needed. The movie was months away from release. He probably thought it wouldn't matter. One scene, 45 seconds. Who'd remember? But something else happened while they were filming. Something that changed everything. June 28, 1971, Columbus Circle, Manhattan. The second annual Italian Unity Day rally. Joe Colombo's big event. 50,000 people gathered. Frank Sinatra scheduled to appear. Colombo took the stage, waving to the crowd. At 11:45 a.m., a black man named Jerome Johnson approached with a camera. Security barely noticed him. Johnson raised the camera. But instead of taking pictures, he pulled out a .32 caliber pistol. 3 shots. All hit Colombo, head and neck. Colombo collapsed. Before Johnson could escape, one of Colombo's bodyguards shot him 7 times. Johnson died instantly at the scene. Colombo survived, but he never really recovered. The bullets left him paralyzed and brain damaged. He lived another 7 years, unable to speak, trapped in his body. He died May 22, 1978, from cardiac arrest. He was 54 years old. The Italian-American Civil Rights League died with him. Nobody ever definitively proved who ordered the hit on Colombo. FBI suspected Carlo Gambino, who resented Colombo's publicity-seeking. Others blamed Joe Gallo, in the middle of a war with the Columbos. Some think it was FBI provocation. Johnson's background was murky. Ex-convict, possible informant, dead before anyone could question him. The investigation went nowhere. But here's what matters for this story. The Colombo family's influence over Godfather production ended the moment those shots fired. No more consultants on set, no more oversight. Coppola was free to finish the film his way, and Montana was suddenly connected to a family whose power was collapsing. The Godfather premiered March 14, 1972. It was an immediate cultural phenomenon. Critics called it a masterpiece. Audiences lined up around blocks. It made $134 million domestic, became the highest-grossing film of all time to that point, won 3 Oscars including Best Picture, changed cinema forever. And Lenny Montana, who couldn't remember his lines, became iconic. That wedding scene people quoted, "Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes." Even though Montana had 2 minutes of screen time maximum, he was memorable. The size, the fear, the authenticity, people remembered him. It didn't lead to a major acting career. Montana got a few more roles. Small parts in mostly forgettable films. Crazy Joe in 1974, about Joe Gallo. Bloodsong in 1982. He appeared on television occasionally. But he was never going to be a professional actor. He didn't have the training or the discipline, and honestly, he didn't need it. He had the one role that would define him forever. What The Godfather did was give Montana legitimate fame, not infamy, fame. People recognized him on the street, asked for autographs, treated him like a star. For a guy who'd spent 20 years in the shadows, burning buildings and breaking bones, this was strange. Novel, and he seemed to enjoy it. Started doing appearances at film conventions. Talked about working with Brando, always respectful, always humble about his lack of talent. But here's what's fascinating. Montana never fully left his old life. He remained connected to organized crime through the 1980s, not as actively as before. But once you're in that world, you never completely leave. Law enforcement monitored him, arrested him in 1968 on arson charges that didn't stick, questioned him about various incidents, but he was smart enough, or lucky enough, to avoid serious prison time. His final years were quiet. He settled in Lindenhurst, New York, Long Island, a suburban life paid for by crime and one lucky break in Hollywood. He'd beaten the odds in every way that mattered. Survived decades in organized crime without getting killed or spending life in prison. Got famous for being himself on screen. Made enough money to retire comfortably. Lenny Montana died May 12, 1992 of a heart attack while visiting Italy. He was 66 years old, buried in St. Charles Cemetery in New York. No major obituaries. No headlines. Just another Brooklyn guy gone. Except this Brooklyn guy had done something no one else had. He'd been in the greatest Mafia movie ever made, playing a role so close to his real life that the performance and the reality were indistinguishable.